Welcome to my YouTube channel, Liturgy of Slaves, Georgia, summer of 1888. A man named Samuel walked into the woods behind Blackwood Plantation with both eyes open. He never walked out the same way again. They found him 3 days later, stumbling through the cotton fields at dawn, his face wrapped in blood-soaked cloth, flies gathering at the edges of the makeshift bandage. His hands reached forward like a child learning to walk in the dark. Someone had taken his sight, not by accident, not by disease, but by decision. Samuel was 26 years old. He had tried to run, he had failed. And Thomas Blackwood, the man who owned the land, the cotton, and until recently, the people who worked it, had made sure Samuel would never try again. This wasn't punishment born from sudden rage. This was policy cold, calculated, a message written in flesh. By 1888, slavery had been legally dead for 23 years. The 13th Amendment had passed. The war had ended. But in Terrell County, Georgia, deep in the southern belly of a wounded nation, still bleeding from its own contradictions, freedom existed only on paper. The planters who had once held human beings as property now held them through debt, through fear, through violence that wore a different name but tasted the same. Thomas Blackwood was not a relic, he was a man adapted to his time. When the law said he could no longer own people, he found other ways to keep them. Sharecropping contracts written in language most couldn't read, debts that multiplied like weeds. And for those who resisted, for those who dared to leave, punishments designed not just to hurt, but to destroy the very possibility of escape. Samuel's blinding was not the first, it would not be the last. Before we continue this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments which city you're watching from. Stories like this must never be forgotten. Let's continue. The plantation sat 5 miles outside Dawson, the county seat, accessible only by a red dirt road that turned to mud when it rained. Blackwood land stretched across 800 acres of prime cotton country, land that had made the family wealthy before the war and kept them comfortable after. The main house stood on a small rise, white columns facing east to catch the morning light, oak trees planted in careful rows along the drive. Thomas Blackwood was 42 in the summer of 1888. He had inherited the plantation from his father, who had inherited it from his father before him. The Blackwood family had worked this soil for 3 generations, and Thomas intended to pass it to his sons unchanged. He was a slight man, narrow in the shoulders, with pale eyes and hands that had never picked cotton. People in town called him educated. He had spent 2 years at the University of Georgia before the war called him home. He read books on agriculture and efficiency. He kept detailed records. He believed in progress as long as it did not threaten his position. The end of slavery had threatened everything. After the war, after the amendment, the Blackwood plantation should have collapsed. Without enslaved labor, the economics of cotton farming changed overnight. But Thomas adapted. He convinced 43 formerly enslaved people to stay on as sharecroppers, promising them a share of the harvest, a cabin to live in, credit at the plantation store. The contracts were complex, the math deliberately confusing. At the end of each season, somehow the workers owed more than they had earned. They could not leave while in debt. The debt never ended. This was the new system, legal, recognized by courts, enforced by sheriffs. Samuel had been born on Blackwood land in 1862, in the last years of slavery. His mother had worked the fields. His father he never knew. After freedom came, Samuel stayed because he had nowhere else to go, and because Mr. Blackwood promised things would be different now. They were not different, the cabins were the same. The work was the same, only the words had changed. But Samuel had a woman he loved, a woman named Clara, who lived on the Henderson place, 6 miles north. They had planned to marry. They had talked about leaving Georgia altogether, maybe going to Alabama, where Clara had family, people who had bought their own land. In May of 1888, Samuel told Thomas Blackwood he intended to leave at season's end, that he would work through harvest, but then he was going. Thomas had smiled. He had said that would be fine as long as Samuel settled his accounts first. The accounts, when Thomas presented them, showed Samuel owing $217, more than 2 years' wages, more than Samuel could ever pay. Samuel understood then he would never be allowed to leave. So on a June night, when the moon was dark and the dogs were quiet, Samuel ran. They caught him in Cuthbert, 23 miles northwest, 2 days after he disappeared. The local sheriff wired Thomas Blackwood, and Thomas rode up with 3 of his men to collect his property. That was the word he used, property, as if the 13th Amendment had never been written. The sheriff in Cuthbert was apologetic when he handed Samuel over. He had picked Samuel up for vagrancy, not knowing at first he was a runaway sharecropper. By the time the mistake was clear, Thomas Blackwood was already on his way. The sheriff was young, perhaps uncomfortable, but he did his job. He put Samuel in chains and waited. When Thomas arrived, he did not speak to Samuel directly. He spoke to the sheriff. "This one has caused considerable trouble," Thomas said. "I've lost 2 days of work searching for him, lost productivity in the fields because the others are watching to see what happens." The sheriff nodded. He understood the situation. Thomas paid him $10 for his trouble. They took Samuel back to Blackwood Plantation in the back of a wagon, wrists chained to the rail. Samuel did not speak during the journey. What was there to say? He had tried, he had failed. Now he would face whatever came next. What came next was worse than he imagined. Thomas Blackwood had developed his policy over the previous 2 years, after 3 other workers had attempted to run. The first time, he had simply beaten the man and put him back in the fields. The man ran again 3 months later and made it all the way to Florida before Thomas stopped looking. The second time, Thomas used harsher methods, breaking the man's leg with a shovel handle. The man never ran again, but he also never worked the same, limping through the rows half as productive as before. Thomas had lost his investment. The third time, Thomas began to think more carefully about the problem. Running required sight. A man could not navigate roads, could not read signs, could not find his way through unfamiliar territory if he could not see. And a blind man, even a healthy one, was no threat to leave. He would be dependent, unable to survive on his own, forced to rely on the very system he had tried to escape. Thomas discussed the idea with his overseer, a man named Pike, who had worked for the Blackwoods since before the war. Pike was not squeamish. He had done hard things when hard things were required. But even Pike hesitated. "You mean to blind them?" Pike asked. "I mean to prevent escape." Thomas said, "This is a practical matter." Pike thought about it. "Law might have something to say. The law says they owe me money. The law says I can recover my losses. What I do on my own land to my own workers is my concern." Pike could not argue with that logic. In Terrell County in 1888, the law was whatever the planters said it was. They had tried the method once before Samuel, on a man who had stolen a ham and tried to run north. Thomas had been methodical. He had used a heated iron rod, carefully applied, destroying the cornea of each eye without killing the man. It had worked. The man survived. He lived in a cabin on the far edge of the property now, cared for by his wife, doing simple tasks he could manage without sight, shelling peas, sorting cotton balls by feel. He had not tried to run again. More importantly, no one else had tried either until Samuel. Thomas had Samuel brought to the barn on the 3rd day after his capture. It was evening, the air thick and hot, cicadas screaming in the trees. 4 men held Samuel down on a wooden table while Thomas prepared the fire. He heated 2 iron rods in the forge until they glowed orange, then red, then white. "You understand this is your fault," Thomas said to Samuel. His voice was calm, almost gentle. "You made a choice. Choices have consequences." Samuel thrashed against the hands holding him, but there were too many, and they were too strong. Someone stuffed a leather strap in his mouth to muffle the screaming. Thomas stepped forward with the first rod. "Hold him steady." The smell came first, burning meat and moisture and something chemical that made the men holding Samuel gag and turn their heads. Samuel's body went rigid, every muscle locked in shock. The screaming around the leather strap was animal, inhuman, a sound that would haunt the men in that barn for the rest of their lives. Thomas worked quickly. He was not cruel by nature. He did not enjoy suffering. This was simply necessary. He pressed the rod to Samuel's right eye, holding it there for a count of 5, then moved to the left. The damage was immediate and total. The heat destroyed tissue faster than the body could respond. By the time Thomas stepped back, both eyes were ruined beyond any hope of healing. Pike poured water over Samuel's face to cool the burns. Samuel had stopped screaming. His body had gone limp, unconscious, or in shock, or perhaps just surrendered to a pain too large to process. "Get him to a cabin," Thomas said. "Have someone tend the wounds. I want him alive." They carried Samuel to the cabin he had shared with 2 other workers and laid him on his cot. A woman named Esther, who had some skill with healing, came to clean the burns and wrap his face. She worked in silence, her hands shaking. When she was finished, she sat beside him through the night, listening to him moan and whimper in his sleep. Samuel did not die. His body, strong from years of labor, fought through the shock and pain. The burns became infected, as burns always did, but Esther cleaned them daily with water and salt, and slowly, impossibly, they began to heal. The flesh scarred, the eyes, what remained of them, sealed shut beneath the new skin. After 3 weeks, Samuel could sit up. After a month, he could walk slowly with a hand on a wall or a stick dragging the ground before him. He would never see again. Word of what happened to Samuel spread through the black community of Terrell County like fire through dry grass. It moved in whispers, in coded language, in warnings passed from one family to another. Asterisk, do not anger, Mr. Blackwood, do not try to leave. Do not think freedom means what the word says it means. Asterisk, Clara, the woman Samuel loved, heard the news from a cousin who worked on a farm closer to Dawson. She walked the 6 miles to Blackwood Plantation on a Sunday in late July, asking to see Samuel. The overseer, Pike, met her at the edge of the property. "He can't see you," Pike said, and then realized the cruelty of the words. "I mean, he can't. You understand?" "I understand," Clara said quietly. "Can I speak to him?" Pike hesitated, then nodded. He led her to Samuel's cabin. Samuel was sitting on the front step when they arrived, his face turned toward the sun he could no longer see. Clara stopped a few feet away, her breath catching in her throat. The scarring was worse than she had imagined. Where his eyes had been, there were only smooth patches of twisted skin, discolored and still healing. "Samuel," she said softly. He turned toward her voice. For a moment he said nothing, and she thought perhaps he did not recognize her. Then he spoke, and his voice was flat, empty of everything it had once held. "You shouldn't have come. I had to see you, well," he said, and the bitterness in that single word was sharper than any blade. "I can't return the favor." Clara sat beside him. She did not touch him. She did not know if touch would be welcome. "We can still leave," she said. "When you're healed, we can go to Alabama. My family will help." Samuel shook his head slowly. How would I work? How would I travel? How would I do anything?" He turned his face toward her, and she had to force herself not to look away. "I'm not a man anymore. I'm a thing, a broken thing." "You're not." "I am," he said, and Blackwood made sure of it. "That's the point. You see that, don't you? This isn't punishment. It's design." Clara stayed with him for an hour, talking softly about things that did not matter, trying to find some thread of the man he had been. But Samuel had gone somewhere she could not follow. The fire had taken more than his sight. It had taken his future, his hope, his sense of himself as someone who could make choices and live with their consequences. When she left, she knew she would not see him again. There was no point. The man she had loved was gone. Samuel lived on Blackwood Plantation for the next 4 years. He worked when he could, doing tasks that did not require sight. Sorting, cleaning, simple, repetitive motions that filled the hours without meaning. Other workers helped him, guided him, fed him when he could not manage alone. He became a ghost haunting the edges of the property, a warning written in flesh. In that time, no one else tried to run. Thomas Blackwood's method had worked exactly as intended, but the world was changing. Even in Terrell County, the federal government, weak and compromised as it was, had begun to pay attention to the worst abuses of the sharecropping system. Newspapers in the North ran stories about peonage and debt slavery. Activists and investigators came south asking questions, documenting conditions. In 1892, a reporter from Atlanta spent 3 days in Dawson interviewing workers and filing dispatches about the treatment of black sharecroppers in southwest Georgia. The reporter heard about Samuel. He came to Blackwood Plantation on a Thursday morning unannounced, claiming to be interested in agricultural practices. Thomas Blackwood, ever conscious of his reputation, gave the man a tour of the fields and the gin house, explaining his operation with pride. The reporter asked polite questions about yields and soil quality. Then he asked about labor practices. "I understand you've had some trouble with workers leaving," the reporter said. Thomas smiled thinly. "No more than any other planter. I heard about a man who was blinded as punishment for running." Thomas's smile did not change. "I don't know where you heard that. I heard it from multiple sources." "Then your sources are mistaken," Thomas said calmly. "I run a fair operation here. My workers are treated well. If a man wants to leave, he's free to go once his debts are settled. That's the law. And if he leaves anyway, then I exercise my legal right to recover my losses." And the reporter wrote it all down. His article ran in the Atlanta Constitution 2 weeks later, a full page describing conditions in Terrell County. It named Thomas Blackwood. It described Samuel's blinding in careful, clinical detail. It called the practice barbaric and un-American. The response was immediate and divided. In the North there was outrage. Congressmen gave speeches. Editorials condemned the practice. Some called for federal intervention. In Georgia, the reaction was different. Many white planters defended Thomas Blackwood. They said the reporter was a liar and an agitator. They said black workers were lazy and dishonest, that harsh methods were sometimes necessary. They said this was a local matter, that outsiders had no right to interfere. The local sheriff, pressured by federal attention, opened an investigation. He interviewed Thomas Blackwood, who denied everything. He interviewed Pike, who said he had no knowledge of any blinding. He interviewed Samuel, who sat silent throughout the questioning. His scarred face turned toward the floor, and when asked directly what had happened to him, said only, "I had an accident." The sheriff closed the investigation after 2 weeks. No charges were filed, but the attention had consequences Thomas Blackwood had not anticipated. Several of his workers, emboldened by the possibility that someone outside Terrell County was paying attention, left the plantation in the autumn of 1892. They did not run. They simply packed their belongings and walked away in daylight, daring Thomas to stop them. He did not. The risk of further federal scrutiny was too great. Samuel was not among those who left. Where would he go? Who would care for him? He stayed in his cabin, working when he could, surviving on the charity of others who had once been his equals and were now his caretakers. In 1893, Thomas Blackwood died suddenly of a heart attack. He was 47 years old. His son William inherited the plantation. William was younger, less rigid in his thinking. He had been educated in Atlanta and had ideas about modernization. He did not approve of his father's methods, though he had never openly opposed them. One of William's first acts was to release all sharecroppers from their debts. The announcement came on a cold morning in January of 1894. William Blackwood gathered all the workers in front of the main house and read from a prepared statement. He said the old contracts were void. He said anyone who wished to leave was free to do so with no debts owed, no obligations remaining. He said those who stayed would be paid cash wages, fair wages for their labor. The workers stood silent, unsure whether to believe what they were hearing. Freedom had been promised before, Promises meant nothing without enforcement, but William was sincere. Over the following weeks, he paid out small sums to workers who chose to leave, enough for travel and a few weeks' expenses. 17 people departed in the first month. Others stayed, cautious but hopeful that this young Blackwood might be different from his father. Samuel stayed because he had no choice. He was 30, 2 years old now, his body still strong, but his spirit hollowed out by 6 years of darkness. He lived in a cabin near the edge of the property with an older woman named Ruth, who had taken pity on him and provided meals and basic care. He spent his days sitting in the sun or shuffling slowly around the cabin, one hand always touching a wall or fence post for orientation. He had learned to navigate his immediate surroundings by memory and sound, but the world beyond that small radius was unreachable. William Blackwood knew about Samuel. Everyone knew about Samuel. He was the living reminder of Thomas Blackwood's cruelty, a wound that had never healed because wounds like that cannot heal. In February, William came to Samuel's cabin. Ruth answered his knock, her body stiffening when she saw who it was. White men at the door meant trouble. It always had. "I'd like to speak with Samuel," William said. Ruth did not move. "He don't want no trouble. I'm not here to cause trouble," William said quietly. "Please." Ruth hesitated, then stepped aside. William entered the small cabin, his eyes adjusting to the dim interior. Samuel sat on a wooden chair near the fireplace, his face turned toward the sound of the door opening. "Samuel," William said, "my name is William Blackwood." Samuel's scarred face remained impassive. "I know who you are." William had rehearsed this conversation in his mind, but now, standing before this man his father had destroyed, the words felt inadequate. "I want to apologize for what my father did to you." Samuel said nothing. "What happened to you was wrong, evil, there's no other word for it. You think I don't know that." Samuel's voice was soft, but there was an edge to it, something sharp beneath the surface. "I want to make it right." "You can't make it right," Samuel said. "You can't give me back what was taken." "No," William admitted. "I can't, but I can offer you money, enough to live on, enough to go wherever you want. Do whatever you can." Samuel laughed, a bitter sound without humor. "Do whatever I can? That's not much, is it?" William had brought a bank draft for $500, more money than Samuel would have earned in 5 years of labor. He placed it on the table. "It's not enough. Nothing would be enough, but it's what I can do." Samuel did not reach for the draft. He could not see it anyway. "Why?" he asked. "Why do you care?" "Because what my father did was wrong, because I have to live with his legacy, because—" William stopped, searching for honesty. "Because I can't undo it, but I can acknowledge it. I can say out loud that it should never have happened." Samuel sat silent for a long moment. Then he said, "Your father used to say the same things you're saying now, that he was fair, that he treated us well, that everything he did was justified." He turned his face toward William, those sealed, scarred eyes somehow still expressive in their ruin. "Words don't mean much, Mr. Blackwood. Your father taught me that." William had no response. He left the bank draft on the table and walked out. Ruth picked up the draft after he was gone, studying the numbers written there. $500, more money than she had seen in her entire life. "What you want me to do with this?" she asked Samuel. "Whatever you want," Samuel said. "It's just paper." But Ruth was practical. She took the draft to the bank in Dawson the next day, cashed it, and hid the money in a jar buried beneath the floorboards of the cabin. She did not tell Samuel about it. What would be the point? Money could not restore sight. It could not undo trauma. But it could buy food and medicine, and Ruth believed in taking care of what was in front of her. Over the next 2 years, life on Blackwood Plantation settled into a new rhythm. William proved true to his word. He paid wages in cash. He did not cheat on the weighing of cotton. He allowed workers to come and go without interference. The place was not paradise, but it was better than it had been. Samuel existed at the margins of this new world. Ruth cared for him, and other workers checked on him occasionally, but he remained isolated, disconnected. He had loved Clara once, had dreamed of a future with her, but that future had been burned away along with his eyes. He heard later that she had married someone else, a farmer in Alabama. He did not blame her. In the spring of 1896, a doctor came to Terrell County. His name was Edward Morrison, and he had studied medicine in Philadelphia before returning to Georgia to serve communities that had no access to medical care. He traveled from town to town, treating injuries and illnesses for whatever payment people could manage. Often that payment was food or labor, but Dr. Morrison did not seem to mind. Someone told him about Samuel. Dr. Morrison came to the cabin on a warm April afternoon. Ruth met him at the door, suspicious of this white man with his leather bag and professional manner. "I'm a doctor," Morrison said. "I heard there's a man here who was injured. I'd like to examine him if he'll allow it." "He don't need examining," Ruth said. "What's done is done." "Perhaps," Morrison said, "but I'd like to see for myself." Ruth looked back at Samuel, who sat in his usual place by the fireplace. Samuel shrugged. What did it matter? Let the doctor look. Let him confirm what everyone already knew. Dr. Morrison knelt beside Samuel's chair and gently tilted his face toward the light from the window. He examined the scarring carefully, his fingers probing the damaged tissue with professional detachment. "How did this happen?" Morrison asked. "Heated iron," Samuel said flatly, pressed to both eyes. Morrison's hands stilled. Good God, who would? He stopped himself. He knew the stories. He had heard whispers about Thomas Blackwood's methods. "When did this happen?" 8 years ago, summer of 1888. Morrison continued his examination. The damage was total. The corneas were destroyed. The interior structures of both eyes compromised beyond any possibility of repair. There was no surgery that could restore Samuel's sight. No treatment that could reverse 8 years of scarring. "I'm sorry," Morrison said finally. "There's nothing I can do." Samuel nodded. "Told you." But Morrison sat back, thinking. "There are schools," he said slowly. "Places that teach blind people to read and work. The Perkins School in Massachusetts, the Tennessee School for the Blind in Nashville. They teach a raise, letter system, ways to navigate, skills for employment." "I'm 34 years old," Samuel said. "Too old for school. They take adults," Morrison insisted. "I've read about it. They've had success teaching people who lost their sight later in life." Ruth was listening now, interested despite herself. "What kind of work?" "Various things. Cane weaving, piano tuning. Some graduates become teachers themselves." Morrison looked at Samuel. "You could have a life beyond this cabin. Independence." Samuel shook his head. "Can't afford it. Can't get there. Can't do any of it." "The money," Ruth said suddenly. "The money William Blackwood gave you, there's still most of it left." Samuel turned toward her, voice surprised. He had forgotten about the money, had dismissed it as meaningless. "How much?" $430, Ruth said. Morrison's eyes widened. That was a substantial sum, enough for travel and tuition and living expenses for a year or more. "That would be enough," he said. "More than enough to get you to Nashville and through the program." For the first time in 8 years, something flickered in Samuel's chest that might have been hope. Not hope for sight he knew that was gone forever, but hope for something else. Purpose, usefulness, a life that was more than waiting to die. "I don't know," he said quietly. "What do you have to lose?" Morrison asked. It was a fair question. Samuel had already lost everything that mattered. What remained was merely existence, and existence without purpose was its own kind of death. "I'll think about it," Samuel said. Dr. Morrison left his contact information with Ruth and promised to return in a month. When he was gone, Ruth sat beside Samuel. "You should go," she said. "Why?" "Because you're dying here, not your body, your spirit. I see it. Everyone sees it." Samuel was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I'm afraid." "Of what?" "Of hoping, of trying and failing, of being a fool." Ruth took his hand, her rough fingers squeezing his. "Baby, you've already been through the worst thing that can happen to a person. Everything else is small compared to that." Samuel left for Nashville in June of 1896. Ruth accompanied him on the train, making sure he arrived safely. staying with him for 3 days until he was settled in the dormitory at the Tennessee School for the Blind. Then she returned to Georgia, leaving Samuel to face his new life alone. The school was overwhelming at first. There were 60 students, ranging from children to adults in their 40s. Some had been blind from birth. Others, like Samuel, had lost their sight to accident or violence. The instructors were patient but demanding. They taught the Braille system, a method of reading through raised dots that Samuel's fingers learned to interpret with surprising speed. They taught mobility techniques, showing him how to use a cane to navigate unfamiliar spaces safely. They taught practical skills: weaving, woodworking, basic repairs. But more than skills, they taught dignity. For 8 years, Samuel had been a burden, a broken thing that others cared for out of pity or obligation. At the school, he was a student, a person with potential. The instructors did not pity him. They expected him to work, to learn, to grow. When he stumbled, they corrected him. When he succeeded, they moved him to the next challenge. It was hard. There were days when Samuel wanted to quit, to return to Georgia and the familiar misery of his cabin. But he stayed, partly because he had nowhere else to go, partly because slowly he was discovering that he could do things he had thought impossible. He learned to read Braille fluently, his fingers moving across the raised dots with increasing speed. He learned to navigate the school grounds independently, using his cane and memory to move through the buildings and pathways without assistance. He learned piano tuning, developing an ear so sensitive he could detect variations in pitch that sighted tuners missed. In his second year, he began teaching other students, helping newcomers learn the basic skills that had once seemed so foreign to him. He was rebuilding himself, the man who had been destroyed in a Georgia barn in 1888 was becoming someone new. Not the same, never the same, but alive again in ways that mattered. In 1899, Samuel graduated from the program. He was 37 years old, and for the first time since his blinding, he had options. The school helped him find work as a piano tuner in Nashville. He rented a small room in a boarding house and began building a modest practice, tuning instruments for churches and schools and wealthy families who could afford pianos. He was not rich, he would never be rich, but he was independent, he earned his own living, he made his own choices. He wrote to Ruth occasionally, dictating letters to a scribe at the boarding house. He told her about his work, about the city, about the life he was building. She wrote back, telling him news from Terrell County. William Blackwood was still running the plantation, still treating workers fairly. The old ways were dying slowly, but dying nonetheless. Samuel never returned to Georgia. There was nothing there for him except memories he preferred to leave buried. In 1902, he met a woman named Alice at church. She was a widow 10 years older than Samuel, partially sighted from cataracts that had progressed through her life. They understood each other in ways that sighted people could not. They married that autumn in a small ceremony attended by friends from the blind community in Nashville. Samuel lived another 23 years. He and Alice ran a small piano tuning business together, serving the black community in Nashville and surrounding counties. They never had children, but they fostered several blind children over the years, teaching them the skills Samuel had learned at the school, giving them the gift of independence. He died in 1925 at the age of 63 of pneumonia. Alice was with him at the end, holding his hand as his breathing slowed and stopped. He was buried in Nashville, far from the Georgia soil where he had been born and broken. The night before he died, while fever clouded his mind, Samuel spoke to Alice about things he rarely mentioned. He talked about the barn, about the fire, about the moment when everything he had been was burned away. "I used to think he destroyed me," Samuel said, his voice weak. Thomas Blackwood, "I used to think he took everything and left nothing." Alice squeezed his hand. "But he didn't." "No," Samuel agreed. "He took my eyes, he took years of my life, but he couldn't take all of me. There was something he couldn't reach, something that survived. Your spirit." Alice said. Samuel smiled slightly. "Maybe, or maybe just stubbornness. Too mean to die, too foolish to give up." "Whatever it was," Alice said, I'm glad you held on to it." Samuel was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I want you to know something. I want you to know that even after everything, even after all that pain, I found good things. I found you. I found work I could be proud of. I found a life worth living." "I know," Alice said softly. "He meant to destroy me," Samuel said, "but in the end I won." Those were among his last coherent words. There is a photograph taken sometime around 1920 that shows Samuel and Alice standing in front of their small home in Nashville. Samuel is wearing a dark suit, his hand resting on a cane. Alice stands beside him, one hand on his arm. Behind them, barely visible in the background, hang several pianos in various states of tuning. Samuel's face in the photograph shows the scarring clearly, the sealed eyes, the twisted skin. But there is something else there, too. Something in the set of his jaw and the slight upturn of his mouth. Not happiness exactly, but peace, resolution. The photograph survived in a collection donated to the Tennessee State Library in 1967. No one knows who took it or why it was preserved, but it remains a small piece of evidence that Samuel existed, that he survived, that he built something from the ruins of what was taken from him. Thomas Blackwood is buried in Dawson, Georgia, in the family plot on the hill behind the old Plantation house. His tombstone lists his birth and death dates and calls him a beloved father and pillar of the community. It does not mention Samuel. It does not mention any of the men and women whose lives he controlled and damaged. History remembers Thomas Blackwood, if it remembers him at all, as a minor figure in the long story of post-Civil War Georgia, a planter who adapted to changing times, a man of his era. Samuel is not remembered in the same way. There are no monuments to him, no markers of his existence beyond that single photograph and a few scattered records. But perhaps that is its own kind of victory. He lived beyond his torture. He built a life beyond his trauma. He refused to be only what was done to him. The barn where Samuel was blinded burned down in 1911, struck by lightning during a summer storm. By then, William Blackwood had converted most of the plantation to mechanized farming, reducing the need for manual labor. The old cabin stood empty, slowly collapsing into the red Georgia earth. The land remembers, even when people forget. The soil that soaked up Samuel's blood and tears, and the smoke of his burning eyes. The roads he walked in darkness. The fields he crossed in his desperate run toward freedom. Memory lives in places in the deep bones of the world, waiting for those willing to listen. Samuel's story is one of thousands, tens of thousands, perhaps more, stories of people who survived systems designed to break them, who found ways to live and love and work despite everything arrayed against them, who refused to be erased. This is how resistance looks sometimes. Not dramatic, not headlines, just one person, one day at a time, choosing to continue, choosing to build, choosing to be more than the violence inflicted upon them. Samuel won, not because he defeated Thomas Blackwood, but because he outlived him, because he found joy after suffering, because he made a life that mattered. In the end, that is what freedom means, not the absence of chains, but the presence of choice, not the erasure of pain, but the refusal to let pain be the final word. Samuel lived that freedom, earned it in darkness, carried it forward into whatever light remained to him. And that, more than anything else, is the story worth remembering. Thanks for watching. Subscribe my YouTube channel. Take care.